the champion of the Constitution, Ron Paul.
Ron Paul. Save our constitutional rights. Ron Paul. When they're gonna give us the fight. Ron Paul. Start a revolution. Break down illegal institutions. We don't want no war no more.
Thank you, thank you.
Bring our boys home to our shores. We don't want big government or the Bilderberg group that pays
Thank you, thank you.
for it.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the revolution. It's great to be here. Representative Overstreet, thank you very much for that very nice introduction and this very nice welcome. Thank you. I want to introduce my wife of 55 years, Carol. And we have one of our 18 grandchildren here. Linda is with us today. But this is fantastic. I hear we have quite a few people, and it looks like quite a few. And we had an earlier event over in Idaho, and it looks like we may have a few more here tonight than... But we're going back to Idaho later on, so we'll see if we can catch up a bit. But it is great, and I am just so impressed with what's going on in the country. I know what's going on in Washington. That's depressing. But what's happening in the country is not depressing, because there are a lot of people like you out there, and we're just finding out where they are, and they're getting very excited. There's a group of people who have known there's been problems but have felt disenfranchised, haven't been involved. They knew exactly what we should have been doing a long time ago. They've sort of dropped out, but they knew and still know exactly what America is supposed to be all about. And I believe they're coming back in the fold and excited. And there's another group coming together with that remnant, and that's called the young people of this country. They're ready. So that's where we should be excited. Ideas have consequences. You have to have ideas. You can't change anything. The type of government a country gets is not an accident. You say, oh no, just so they messed up when they got there. No, they got there, and most of them stayed there, and they thought it was going to go on forever. They thought we could live beyond our means, borrow money and print money and do the things that they've been doing, never realizing there was an end point. And though there's been a lot of us working in the vineyards and trying to get the attention of the people, the real attention has occurred just recently, and it's in the last 4 or 5 years. The discovery that this country's bankrupt, and we just can't continue this spending. We have to quit the spending. The financial crisis that hit in 07 and 08 was an eye-opener. People know that we can't afford it anymore. But it's also been an eye-opener for what we've been doing overseas. Most people now are starting to realize that when countries grow too big and extend themselves around the world, which countries have done for 1,000 years, they do that and they think they're invincible and they go too far. I think the American people are waking up and say, why are we wasting our resources, our financial resources, our lives, our young people overseas doing things that don't serve our interests? And this is what they've discovered. 10 years of war is too long. Well, what a difference there is when a country goes to war in a more proper manner. We, up until World War II, we made declarations of war, we fought them, we got them over, and then we came home. But here we are, we're involved in undeclared wars, unwinnable wars, and unnecessary wars. And we have been there for over 10 years. World War II, fighting the Japanese and the Germans in less than 4 years. that war was won. We've been there 11 years in Afghanistan, and the people now, especially just recently, a lieutenant colonel came out and said, it's bad news over there. They're fibbing to you, and some people call it lying to us about the American people and what's happening. He says, we're not accomplishing anything. And the evidence is coming clear, and the statement made in the introduction about who do the military support ought to tell this country, let's wake up. It's time to end these wars. We can't afford them. They're of no benefit to us. And that means we need to bring our troops home. But we need representative government that actually takes their oath of office seriously. This is the #1 reason why we're in the trouble that we are today. We've had too many people go to Washington, they take the oath of office, they have no remorse, they don't think they've done anything wrong, they just think, well, the Constitution is a pliable document, we have to modernize it, and we vote any way we want. But that is the reason we got into this mess. If we got into this mess by not having constitutionalists in Washington, the way we get out of this mess is send only individuals to Washington that will obey the Constitution, the rule of law. We've been going to war without declaration of war, but what about the money issue? Where did they get this authority to say that a group of individuals in a secret room can decide how much money is going to be and who gets it? That system doesn't work. It serves the interests of the special interests. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It needs to be exposed and then removed from this. You know, the founders were very clear on this. This was one of the reasons there was a constitutional convention, because they had to run away inflation. The continental currency was destroyed. So they wanted to take care of this problem, and they said only gold and silver could be legal tender. There could not be emitting of bills of credit, which is paper money, and no authority was given for a central bank. And what have we done? We've just totally ignored it. We've ignored it for 100 years. But 100 years is long enough. The experiment has been there, and they've been running roughshod over us, especially since 1971, when the last link to gold was severed. So I would say 100 years is long enough. We've learned our lessons. Let's go back to the Constitution and have sound commodity money. There's quite a few reasons why we should have that. Constitutionally is obviously a very good reason. Another is economically. The Federal Reserve System is responsible for the business cycle. They inflate the currency, they distort the currency, they create the bubbles which serves the special interest, and then when the bubbles burst, guess what? They go and bail out the people who are suffering from the bubbles being burst. So it also is a moral issue, because if you or I counterfeited the currency, we'd all go to jail. But we allow our government through the Federal Reserve to counterfeit the money. That's what they're doing. They're debasing the currency. They're destroying the value of the money. So there's the moral issue. But one other issue and reason why it's so dangerous to have a monetary system like this is it allows governments to grow in a seductive manner. If we had a government that always paid its bill, and something Jefferson argued with, he didn't want, not only did he not want to print the money, he didn't want to borrow the money either. But think of what it would be like if we had to pay the bills as we went along. The American people would rebel. Because they would, just realize how much this is costing and how much harm they are doing. So I one time thought if I could get a bill passed to solve that problem, this would be very beneficial. So my suggestion, with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, was let's get rid of the withholding tax. Let's make everybody write a check to the U.S. government every month, and boy, we'd have our revolution. But of course, they gave us the income tax. That's another little item we want to take care of. We want to get rid of that income tax and repeal the 16th Amendment. But we embarked 100 years ago into the welfare warfare state, and since they knew direct taxation to pay the bills wouldn't be very popular, then they started borrowing money to a large degree, and then, of course, inventing the Federal Reserve so they could just print the money. And a country can get away with that a while. It delays the payment. You don't notice it. Some people suffer. Some people suffer. They don't realize that other people benefit. So it's very, very destructive. And it seems to work for a while when the country is wealthy. But we're not wealthy anymore. We've destroyed the productivity of this country. We have undermined the foundations of our currency and our economic system. So therefore, we're at a point now where all they do is print the money, and we've had special benefits because after the Bretton Woods broke down in 1971, we were able to be the printer of the world, print the dollar because it was still accepted as if it were gold. And that was an illusion. It's been an illusion, but the illusion is coming to an end because it will be rejected. Economic law, moral law, demands that this will be rejected, and we're in the middle of this. We're in the midst of a worldwide crisis in currency and financial problems that we have today. And yet, our government, through our Federal Reserve, currently are very much involved with the economic crisis of Europe because our banks have investment in their banks. They're in on this together. The banks in Europe bought up all this bad debt from Spain and from Greece and Italy, and they're bankrupt. So, well, we can't allow the banks to go bankrupt, too big to fail. So they've been promised that our dollars will bail them out. This is wrong. This is wrong. But when, if we allow them to happen, and of course if this continues, it'll be eventually the rejection of the dollar. And the total rejection of a currency can come rather rapidly, and it's a financial crisis that is uncontrollable, which can lead to a political crisis. This is why it's good to have a plan and improvise a plan where we work our way out of it. This is why I'm saying cut $1 trillion, cut $1 trillion and back off and shrink the size of government. But we already see, you know, Greece just the other day accepted a plan for the 15th time on what to do. And of course it was to cut down back on some of the jobs and some of the welfare. But there are riots in the streets because they believe, as many people in this country believe, they're entitled to it. They believe entitlements are rights. Entitlements aren't right. You have a right to your life. You have a right to your liberty. You should have a right to keep the fruits of your labor, but you're not entitled to take your neighbor's property through the politicians. But because we allowed government to grow in this seductive manner, borrowing and printing money, when government gets bigger, it only gets bigger by shrinking our liberties. And now we're in a crisis period because our personal liberties are under systematic attack. These last 10 years have been very devastating, even to the point now recent law actually has repealed some of the provisions of the Magna Carta. You know, that's a few years old, and yet we're repealing that, like allowing the military to arrest American citizens and held without a trial indefinitely. So our liberties are being threatened, and therefore we have to take a stand, and that's where I'm encouraged. There's a lot more people today wanting to take a stand, and they can and they will. But we have to realize that we need to understand what the principles of liberty is all about. I believe we have to know that governments can't give us our liberty. The most they can do is to protect our liberties. But our liberties, our life and our liberties come from our Creator, or in a natural way. It's a gift given to us, and we should own our lives, and we should own the fruits of our labor. But if we assume the government's doing it, it won't work. The effort to do this will require a lot of effort. It requires a lot of political efforts, obviously, but the political effort actually is secondary to the intellectual efforts. Ideas have consequences. I'm absolutely convinced of this, and I think that's what's happening in the country. People are coming to the obvious conclusion and the correct conclusion that the age of Keynesianism and inflationism and deficit financing, the age is over. We have to live up and be honest with ourselves. This is, if we recognize that, then we can start doing the right things. Being in denial is one thing, and we've been in denial. We believe for too long that we can continue to do this. When the country was super wealthy, and we were at one time, we're not now. We were the wealthiest country in the world, and we had the largest middle class. And today, our middle class is shrinking. It's shrinking in size, and it's shrinking in wealth. And the wealth, of course, is gravitating to the few. Now, the few, you know, that's a mixed bag on challenging those few who have a lot of money. In a free society, there will always be rich people. And if a person is rich or a company is rich or if somebody sells us a product that we like, and they make a lot of profit because we make them profitable, and we buy their goods, we like their product, and they make a lot of money, and they get no benefits from the government, we shouldn't frown on that. But if a company gets very, very big because they get special deals and contracts and they're part of the military-industrial complex because they're part of the banking system and they get bailed out by the government, that's a different story. We should deny them the special benefits and deny them the bailouts. One other thing that is very healthy that's happening is the failure of this redistribution of wealth for the benefit of the poor. Libertarians and conservatives have done a lousy job over the years, especially when we were so wealthy. It was hard to say, oh no, we can't do that, well, this will lead to some problems, and by just forcibly trying to help certain groups. But the evidence is here now. You know, governments have nothing, they produce nothing, they only can steal from one group and give to another. So there is no such thing as free medical care. There's no such thing as free education. There's no such thing as free housing. And yet, oh yes, or you people just don't care about people. So we have had in the past at least lost a humanitarian argument. Because if you weren't caring enough to take from one group to another, you don't care about poor people. But what happens if it becomes so clearly obvious that this system of government is no better than socialism, that it destroys wealth and makes more people poor? This is what's happening to us today. And there's nothing clearer than the housing bubble that we had. The housing program was set up, easy credit, affirmative action programs, Community Reinvestment Act, tell banks what they had to do, make sure poor people had their houses. But then some people ended up with a house that they really couldn't afford. And some people made a lot of money off the deal. The brokers and the mortgage people and the gamblers with the derivatives and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they made billions of dollars. And then, of course, when the bubble burst, as was predictable, then they say, well, you have to bail us out. We're too big to fail. And what happened? They got bailed out. They're back in business again. But what happened to the middle class? The middle class people lost their jobs and they lost their houses. It's proof that this program of government intervention and planning doesn't work, and therefore we have to restore our understanding of how the market works, understand the confidence that free people can take care of more people than all the government programs put together. Governments will never be perfect, and the closer the government is to our home, the better it is. And right now, we fight and try to keep the federal government smaller and keep more government locally. But we also have to be very much aware of international government that's coming. There is so much of that. They're talking about another, a substitute for the current monetary system, a new currency under the United Nations and the IMF. And of course, I see our national security hindered by belonging to those groups. That's never helped by belonging to the United Nations and going to war under a UN resolution or under NATO. Not even conferring with the Congress is the way they do this. So local government is really what we want, and that's what the founders gave us. They gave us a republic. They wanted the states to be as independent as possible. Does that mean the states would run things perfectly? No, but it would be a lot easier changing one state than when you have to change, you know, the whole country at one time or the whole world at one time. But once we have accepted this notion that it's okay for this because government's always going to help us, and we let this money gravitate to Washington, whether it's in income taxes and user fees and highway fees and everything else. The money goes to Washington, but it never gets distributed fairly. The bureaucrats get control of it. It's a political system. And then when they finally send some of our money back to us, guess what you get? A ton of regulations. You're not even able to spend your own money again. It isn't your own money because we sacrifice the independence of the states by allowing our governments to do this. And the same way with individuals. If we think that we can benefit from a government medical program, oh yeah, you'll give up for that. And then they're going to argue over mandatory health programs on whether the insurance company must give birth control pills or not give birth control. That is so far removed from what a free society is all about. In a free society, you wouldn't have those kind of silly debates, you know, about who's going to distribute birth control pills. We have lost our confidence in property rights. The government really owns the property. They own us when they invented the income tax. The income tax is based on the assumption, even if it's a low percentage, the assumption is the government owns all your income and the government will permit you to keep a certain percentage under certain conditions. And we jump through all the hoops. So it's the principle of the government ownership, you know, of our income. But once we succumb to the regulatory agencies of the federal government, as well as many local governments too, that our land isn't our land anymore. Our land is we have the liabilities of the land, we pay the rent, but if anything goes wrong, it's our fault. But if we want to use it, how many permits do you have to have? You know, it's just so out of control. And we have a federal register that continues to grow. People talk about it a little bit, but it always grows by the tens of thousands of pages. I don't know if any one individual could possibly understand what's in the federal register. But there's one promise that I'll make. I will not expand the size of the federal register. I will shrink the size of the federal register. Besides, the executive branch doesn't have constitutional authority to write regulations. Those are laws. And they're very, very complex. And it's the Congress's fault. It's our fault for allowing our members of Congress to default and allow the courts and the executive branch to write law. Only the Congress is supposed to write law. And the president should not be allowed to make use of what they call the signing statements. Oh, I'll sign this bill, but about 2/3 of it I don't like, so I'm not going to pay any attention to that. So he signs a statement like a line item veto. I have no intention on having line item vetoes or signing these statements. Also, a president has no authority to write executive orders. We've heard this president say, well, they're not moving fast enough along on some of these environmental issues. I'll just write an executive order. You know, this is not part of the system, and yet the complacency is getting smaller. People are waking up. I think we can say we've had enough of this. We want our freedoms back. In an age that we live in, and especially this last 12 years, especially since 9/11. 9/11 was a disaster. It was a disastrous day for us, and everybody understands that. But it was also an opening for people who wanted to do things they've been trying to do for a long time. For instance, the whole issue of Iraq was talked about and planned many, many years before 9/11. But they saw this as an opportunity. The first speech I gave on Iraq was in 1998, because that is when they said our policy in the United States now is to have regime change. So I was speaking out then, but after 9/11, you know, they concentrated too much on going into countries that had nothing to do with 9/11, occupying these countries while ignoring the people that I voted for to go after was the Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. But it took us 10 years to find him, and yet we went and occupied all these countries. We lost 8,500 Americans, 40-some thousand of severe injuries, hundreds of thousands of veterans today who are looking for help for post-traumatic stress syndrome and brain injuries, and the facilities aren't available. And we don't even know why we're there. This is why the military support my candidacy, because they know that the wars over there are not good wars at all. A young man asked me earlier today, he says, well, when would you be able to bring the troops home? I said, well, I've been asked that question before. My answer is, as soon as I can send the ships. And they'll come up with all kinds of excuses, but I say, we just marched in, we can just march home. We're not at war. We've been in police actions, and it's not called war anymore. It's called kinetic military action. So as long as it's kinetic military action, we don't have to worry too much about it. So, but we need, of course, an overhaul in the foreign policy. They'd like to paint us as not caring about the world, but the founders were very explicit about foreign policy. They wanted a foreign policy of friendship and trade with people. Haven't we been a lot better off with the Chinese and the Vietnamese now that we've been trading with them rather than killing each other? I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it expanded, and that decade was terrible. It took another 10 years to get out of there, and I mean, no Americans want to be defeated and lose a war. But we lost the war. We came home. It was a loss. And we have to learn our lessons from this. And when McNamara wrote his memoirs, McNamara orchestrated the whole war. But he was somewhat subdued before he died. He wrote this memoir. And one of the reporters asked him, he says, does that mean you want to apologize? And he said something rather unique. He said, what good is an apology? He says, the only thing that counts is that if you recognize your mistakes and change your policies. That is what we have to do. But the French and the Americans were in Vietnam for a long, long time. A lot of people died, probably, of course, we lost 60,000, and there were probably 1 million Vietnamese that died. And just think, now the fact that we were there was to stop a domino effect of communism. And we left, and there was no domino effect. It looks like the domino happens to be the spread of capitalism to the Far East. I mean, the Chinese are now our bankers, and we're beholden to them. But we trade with Vietnam, we travel back and forth, we invest over there and they come over here. Just think how much more was achieved in peace than was achieved in war. And I don't understand. But that's exactly what the founders talked about. Others want us to be around the world because of this mystical thought that it's American exceptionalism. I think America is an exceptional nation, but this has been hanging around for a long time, that we have an exceptional system. We have the perfect political system, and therefore we have this moral, evangelical obligation to spread our perfect system to the world and teach them to be good Democrats and have elections and all these. Of course, we go over there, we invade them, we fight wars, we set up a government, they have an election, and they elect the wrong people, so we have to throw them out. But we've been doing that for a long time. But the exceptionalism of our country, we can restore that. That means we have to have a free and prosperous country. We have to once again really protect our civil liberties, and we have to have a more peaceful approach to the world. If we set a good example and we're free and prosperous, you know, it just may be that somebody else might say, well, that is a good example. Maybe they would want to emulate us. Wouldn't that be so much better than us trying to force it down their throat with a bunch of guns? But you know, after 9/11, of course, the one plan was that they had the opportunity to pass an act that they've been trying to pass for quite a few years. Most people know it as the Patriot Act. When I quizzed one of my fellow members about why he was voting for it, he said, how can I vote against the Patriot Act under these circumstances? It was a couple weeks after 9/11. He said, I could never explain that to my people back home. I said, but that's your job. Go home and explain it to them. But one thing for sure is, if you look at a bill written in Congress and you see a title to it, make the immediate assumption it's going to do exactly the opposite of what the title says. Now, if they'd have been more honest and said this is repeal the Fourth Amendment bill, they wouldn't have been able to vote for it, and these things wouldn't get passed. But that is essentially what it's done. This has introduced the whole notions about how they treat us at the airports, part of the Patriot Act attitude. No reasons for search warrants, no reason for probable cause, just because, oh, we're going to make you safe. They're working on the assumption that we will always be cowed into believing that we're only going to be safe if we turn all the responsibility over to the government and give up our civil liberties. It's wrong. You never have to sacrifice your liberties for security. The president, approximately 1 year ago, sent somebody over to the Senate to testify and announced a new policy. The new policy was that even if you're an American citizen, the president has the authority to assassinate him without charges and without a trial, because he's a bad person. Well, I would say he's a suspect, and maybe he's a bad person, but didn't Adolf Eichmann get a trial? Israel gave him a trial, and he was prosecuted and was killed. Timothy McVeigh was given a trial. But the bad people are supposed to be given trials so that we're always protected no matter what charges are made against us. So this is a very dangerous thing to do. But the president the president proved that he was the king because he's already assassinated 3 Americans to test the waters. So you say, well, that's only 3, that's only 3. But it's the precedent that counts. If it's set up that way, when chaos comes, which it can come, we want to know whether we're going to have any protections by the rule of law, and right now it's fading away from us, and that's what we have to be alarmed about and change. But the Congress didn't do much better. They delivered to the president in December, and he signed it on Happy New Year, first day of January. He signs the National Defense Authorization Act. Now here's a bill that repealed posse comitatus, which prohibits the military getting involved in civil law. But not only do they allow the Army now to get involved and arrest people, the Army can arrest an American, and once again, American suspect, because he's with even those considered associated with certain elements. Just associated. And no charge is made that they can be arrested by the military, denied legal counsel, put in prison indefinitely. This cannot stand. This is not what America is all about. There are other areas of our law which has undermined our personal liberties. I happen to think the enforcement of the income tax is deeply flawed because it's based on the assumption that if the tax people ever charge you for anything, you're guilty until proven innocent. That's not the way it's supposed to be. They're supposed to prove our guilt instead of saying you are guilty, you prove your innocence, or you will have to suffer the consequences. But we also have another war that's going on. Basically, all wars are against the American people. War overseas is an economic detriment, and it sets the stage for a violation of our civil liberties. But there's been another war going on. It was started back at the time income tax and Federal Reserve came in, but not very much. It was accelerated in the early 1970s under Nixon, and that is the war on drugs. But that's a war on the American people. Now this attitude that the government has this responsibility to be so much involved that it means that they pass laws like as a consequence of the drug laws that American people can't grow hemp. You know, hemp is a really dangerous product. Did you know that? It's probably dangerous to some of my cotton growers down in Texas. It might be what is dangerous. But hemp is a product that has been around since the beginning of our country, and we used it in World War II. But because the plant looks like marijuana, therefore you can't grow it, and it just makes no sense. Then once the government decides that they can tell you what you can put in your own body, means you don't own your own body. So some might argue and say, well, it's necessary. There's a bunch of junk out there. Yeah, at the junk food stores maybe too. Of course, then you say that, and they'll run and regulate everything that you take into your bodies. But taking it into our bodies, it should be our business. And if you harm your body, it should be your business too, and not your neighbor's business. You can't go crawling to your neighbor and say, well, I overdid it, so to be taken care of. But how else does this backfire on us? Well, it will backfire on maybe nutritional products. Maybe the federal government will start regulating vitamins and nutritional products and alternative health care. Wow. So that is the natural consequence. You say, well, prevent the use of some of these bad drugs, and then we sacrifice our liberties. But, if you look at the drugs are really bad. I really am annoyed, and hopefully, teach my patients and my family and all how deadly drugs are. But the people who die and are more addicted are prescription drugs. They're killing more people. The issue isn't the danger. The issue is who's responsible for the danger. Who's responsible for teaching children about fire and automobiles and heights and all these other things. It's us that's the responsibility, but assume that, oh, you know, the government is going to take care of us. If the government would just have tougher, stricter laws, my son would have never gone on drugs and these kind of arguments. But, you know, we've even gotten to the point where the government now, the federal government, is regulating drinking raw milk. If we are allowed to deal with our eternity and all that we believe in spiritually, and if we're allowed to read any book that we want under freedom of speech, why is it that we can't put into our bodies what we want? And if there are dangers out there, maybe we can take care of that. If you want to compare dangers, I mean, intellectually, I mean, just think of authoritarian fascism, communism, how many people did that kill, and how bad some of the silly things that people do in the name of religion. And then all of a sudden, they concentrate, and we've given up this one element. The one problem we've had for 100 years or so, and the founders didn't have this problem. Freedom was freedom. Freedom was one unit. Freedom was personal liberty, social liberty, religious liberty, but it was also economic liberty too, and it came together. But what we need to do is bring that back together. We have some groups defending economic liberty to a fair degree, and others defend personal liberties to a degree. But we have to bring this together and ask some people, you know, why they don't see this and you know, why aren't you more consistent in defending liberty? I know that one thing for sure is when people do understand freedom, freedom is very popular. And the wonderful thing about a free society, people come together. Not because we want to do things there, not because we want to go to the same church or read the same books or take the same vitamins or feed ourselves. It's not that reason. We come together because we all want to make our own choices. That's what brings us together. And I think that is what's happening. I am very encouraged. The college campuses are alive and well. The remnant is waking up. The message is out there. We don't have to invent anything new. Freedom has been around. We don't have to go back to the Dark Ages. If you go back to the Dark Ages, which they accuse us of doing sometimes, oh, you want to go back to this and back to that. Freedom is relatively new. Authoritarianism, dictatorship, tyranny, that's what's old. Most of the world throughout history has lived under tyrants. Samuel Adams said that all we need to bring about changes is to have an irate, tireless minority. That is what will do the trick. But our irate, tireless minority is getting bigger all the time. That's what's so great. But it is never required that 51% has to move a country. Rarely, it almost never happens. But people who are strong believer in issues and ideas and principles, they do lead the way. So any individual that would come to a meeting like this are interested in these viewpoints. But you're still in the minority. But you still have the influence. You have the influence throughout your life. But your first obligation is to learn and study and explain what this all means. But in another sense, then you have to dedicate yourself. If you believe in it, you don't do it because you're doing me a big favor. You do it because it's a big favor to you and your family, and you want to live in a free society. That's why you do it. And there is no doubt the need for it. The need is so evident now, more so than ever before. And we have this message, and we go back and we pick up the pieces. And we left it, and we have forgotten it for 50 years for sure, longer than that even. But we need to decide if we can look at our history and say, yes, they had some very good ideas. The founders did have some great ideas. But there were imperfections, there's no doubt about it. But they also warned about the imperfection. The only way a constitution, even if it could be perfectly written, is only as good as the people. The people who are obligated to live under it. An immoral people cannot manage a moral document. So it is the morality of the people that ultimately really counts. And but we have an election coming up. There'll be one here shortly in the state of Washington, and quite a few will be coming in March, and a difference will be made. You know, what happens, I don't know. I don't try to say I know what's going to happen on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. I have a pretty good grasp of what happens if we don't change our ways, if we continue to spend money. I know what's going to happen. Not when exactly or how it's going to come about. I know what will happen if we go into wars unnecessarily and fight wars that are ridiculous. And those kind of things are happening. So you can understand events in the directions of a country, but whether it's going to be tomorrow or next day. But I am convinced that the foundations of our liberties and our financial system is very, very fragile. And when you see the laws coming around to say that we can use the military to round up people, when you see the riots going on in countries that are being denied some of their benefits, it gets a little frightening. But where I get the encouragement is coming to a group like this who are excited about freedom and a return to these concepts of liberty. For that reason, I remain an optimist. I believe we can restore America to its greatness.
Was president, he'd eliminate the deficit, lead the generation next to live, keep the Constitution relevant, everybody would benefit. If Ron Paul was president, he'd eliminate the deficit, lead the generation next to live, keep the Constitution relevant, everybody would benefit. Ron Paul's the only one I'd ever elect president, cause I don't believe in BS and the people selling it. We shouldn't be working for peanuts cause we ain't elephants. I do.
Welcome to Washington. Question, you want to cut $1 trillion from the federal budget immediately. Do you risk job growth if you do that so fast, just when the recovery is getting off the ground?
I'm having an argument currently with Bernanke. He argues that it could be damaging, but I believe he doesn't have any credibility because he didn't predict the housing bubble. No, it doesn't. An example I use is we brought 10 million people home in World War II. We cut 60% of our budget, we cut taxes by 30%, we had economic growth for the first time in about 17 years. So I would say no. People think because the government's not spending the money, there would be a negative. But when the government spends the money, it's a double negative. First, they take the money from the people, and when they spend it, it's not well spent. But if the people spend $1 trillion, it'll be wisely spent.
How do you win a state like Washington? The polls show most support abortion, most support gay marriage. You don't.
Incorrect. That was an incorrect statement. I voted for repeal. Don't ask me.
Do you support gay marriage?
I support that. I want the government out of that. It's totally completely. I have no prohibitions against whatever, but people can do whatever they want.
Any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question about federal transportation. There's a real attempt to replace the Interstate 5 bridge here, a $3 billion project. Of course, they want big federal funding for it. What do you think about that, and what do you think generally about?
Well, it's an example, I believe, of the mess the government creates. They take the money on our highway funds, and they're supposed to give them back to us, and then you have to play a political game. But you should, I believe that when they take our money from our highway funds and our taxes, our highway taxes, they should send us the money back, and the people should decide how it should be spent. They shouldn't take our money and then put all these conditions on it. So it's the system that is bad, but no. But the problem is they have these highway funds, and they're not in the trust fund. They went and spent them on the wars and spent them on this nonsense. And
Do you think you really have a chance here in this election?
Yes.
Why?
Because there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of people here believe in freedom. We just have to galvanize them and get them to the polls.
How do you think it went?
I think it's great. People here. thousand.
The medical marijuana with the
No, the
dispensaries.
federal government should be out of it completely. They shouldn't be involved. The state should be able to make these laws, and the matter of fact, the government should be allowing and protecting freedom of choice. But here, the states' rights laws, and then the government comes in and overrides them. No, I don't want the federal government overriding state.